Video games can use progression to solve so many problems. They can create self-correcting difficulty curves, build anticipation, force pacing, and so much more. Not to mention that feeling you get when you finally max out your damage and you're able to just blow through enemies you once found difficult. But as of now, my game has absolutely zero progression. It's about time to change that. Currently, when you start a new run, you'll be given a random primary and secondary weapon, as well as a perk for the primary weapon and a buff for both. For example, this run, I got the ability to see enemies through walls, a mag buff for my primary weapon, and a damage buff for my secondary weapon. This system is pretty cool as the different abilities cause the player to play with different playstyles, but it doesn't allow for the player to shape the game to fit their own playstyle, and even more importantly, it doesn't include any form of progression. So here's the plan. Instead of flat out giving the player abilities and buffs right at the start of every run, they will instead be given the opportunity to choose between one of 3 upgrades every time they complete a level. This will allow the player to pick abilities that fit their playstyle, as well as allowing them to progress by stacking the upgrades. But to prevent the player from getting too powerful too quickly, the player won't just be able to use all the upgrades right away. Instead, they'll need to equip them in a separate menu. By default, the player will only be able to equip 1 perk and 2 buffs, but one of the upgrades presented at the end of the level has a chance to be an extra slot. I find that, especially from a coding perspective, when taking on a task, it's best to split it into 2 more but easier tasks. Then split those tasks into 2 more tasks and so on until you have a bunch of very small baby tasks. So start by splitting getting upgrades at the end of every level and equipping them to getting upgrades at the end of every level and equipping them. Then equipping them can be split into making an equip menu and being able to open and close this menu. Then being able to open and close this menu can turn into being able to open the menu and being able to close the menu. Making an equip menu can become being able to view abilities and being able to change those abilities. Okay, let's start with being able to view these abilities. It should be pretty easy, which is the point. That's why we break the problems down. We just go through all the selected abilities the player has and display them on the screen. But being able to change the selected abilities is actually a lot harder than it sounds, which is why I actually ended up splitting it up into 6 more steps. But because YouTube has an algorithm and because I want views, I'm pretending it was just one easy step. Basically, whenever the player clicks on an ability, they reset it to the next acquired ability that isn't already selected. But what if all acquired abilities are already selected? Well, then we just tell the computer to throw a temper tantrum. Opening the menu can be split into detecting when the player presses a button, pausing the game, and displaying the menu on the screen. Closing the menu turns into detecting when the back button is pressed, unpausing the game, and removing the menu from the screen. I also added the weapons icons above and made it so that if you hover over them, you get to see the weapons details. I'm really happy with how it turned out. Right now, there are not that many abilities in the game, but hopefully as more get added, some emergent synergies will start to pop up. For example, there's this versatile perk where your primary buff also applies to your secondary weapon, allowing you to stack 2 damage buffs onto your secondary weapon, basically turning it into an OP sniper. If anyone else has any ideas for abilities or buffs, especially ones that could synergize, feel free to leave a comment or send me a Discord message. I'm also really having trouble finding playtesters, so if any of you would be down to test the game, again, just send me a Discord message saying so and I'll send over a Steam key. Right now it's only available on Windows, but I do plan to eventually get it on PlayStation and Xbox. Now for selecting a new upgrade at the end of every level, I don't want the player to need to do it in yet another menu. Instead, I want the player to be able to see the upgrade in the world and be able to select the one they want by shooting it. See the upgrade in the world can become have a UI element face the camera and have the UI element display information about the upgrade. Being able to shoot the upgrade becomes adding a cube that can collide with bullets, acquiring the ability when the cube is shot, and finally removing all other cubes from the world when the cube is shot. With that, half of the progression system has been added. Now before I get into the next half of the progression system, which is really what's going to bring the whole thing together, I think it's important to mention that similarly to how I had to simplify being able to change selected abilities, there are actually a lot of other steps that had to be simplified for the sake of the video. I find that most devlogs forget to mention all the small hiccups and road bumps that stood in their way, but this is what the task breakdown actually looks like. Now, let me give an example. Getting the UI to face the camera isn't as simple as just telling the computer to do that. I mean, it could be if I use the find look at rotation node, but I gotta do something else so I want the UI to line up with the faces of the cube. So let's go on a little coding side quest. To make this easier, I'm gonna pretend I'm doing it in 2D. It's pretty much the same thing as doing it in 3D anyway. I'll place the cube here with an X location of 100 and Y location of 100, and with a rotation of 0, meaning that it's facing upwards. And let's just stay with a width of 10 and a height of 10. Then I'll place the player right here, 120 on the X and 200 on the Y. Now to us, obviously the UI element should line up with this side, but how do we define this in instructions the computer could understand? For now, let's just ignore the UI's rotation and just focus on which side of the cube we want it to be positioned. We can first narrow down whether we want it to align on the X or Y axis relative to the cubes by finding the difference in the players and the cube's X axis, finding the difference in the players and cube's Y axis, and finally comparing the results. So if the difference in the X is bigger, Like in this example, we'd move the UI on the x-axis, so either here or here. But in our case, because 120 take away 100 is actually less than 200 take away 100, we'll need to move the UI on the y-axis, so either here or here. Next, we need to figure out by how much the cube should be offset. We can normalize the difference in the chosen axis to get a number that will either be 1 or -1. To normalize it, we can just divide the difference in the chosen axis by the absolute value of itself. So in our case, 100 divided by 100 equals 1. If you're back in this example, -50 divided by 50 would be -1. Now we can just multiply the number we got by the cube's apothem to get the amount that the UI should be offset. That's the apothem. So to recap, in this situation, we'll move the cube on the y-axis because the difference in the y-axis is bigger. Next, we normalize the difference in the y, giving us the number 1. Then we multiply 1 by the apothem, 5. Now we move the UI by 5 on the y. In this situation, we move the cube on the x-axis because the difference in the x-axis is bigger. Yo, Post Connor here, the lazy guy. I realized that technically 50 take away 100 would be -50, and so technically it would be the smaller number. So in reality, you would do the absolute value of the differences in the axes, or in the axes. Anyway, doesn't matter. You get the point. Next, we normalize the difference. You know what? Hold on. I don't think it's really fair to call me lazy, okay? I've, for the past couple days, been editing this video. You know, Des Connor's just talking. He's just talking. I have been taking screenshots of, these graphics that I've made to try and, make the explanation as, understandable as possible. I'm doing the heavy lifting. It's don't call me lazy, okay? It's why does the other Connor get all the attention? Next, we normalize the difference in the x, giving us the number -1. Then we multiply -1 by 5, and finally move the UI by -5 on the x. This is what the code looks like for those who are curious. Now I can see that this part of the video has already gotten pretty long, so I'll just resume how we solve the rotation. We take the normal of the difference of the chosen axis, which again is that number that's either 1 or -1, and then multiply it by 90. We also add -90 if the difference on the y-axis is bigger. For those who are curious, I'm actually gonna go over the code and actually break down what each block does. I realized that I kind of forgot to include that in the original script, so I'll do that at the end, after the outro. All right, now that you got some screen time, are you gonna stop bitching? Hey, give me my hat back! Alright, with the coding side quest done, the last thing I want to bring up are the surprising amounts of quality of life changes that basically go unnoticed. For example, stopping the game from picking 2 levels in a row, adding these damage numbers, blood effects on the screen, a leaderboard, 100 other things. So all these things are important, but people don't really notice that they're there. It's kind of expected. All this isn't to complain about the amount of work, but it really is important to me that you know that this shit is work. Okay, so I did mention that there would be another half to the progression system that would bring the whole thing together, and although that is true, there will be one, just not today. A while ago, I watched a really well-made video made by Vile Hyperion on how Valheim handles its progression. I really recommend you watch it, but basically the game has you complete a boss battle, which will unlock the resources necessary to upgrade your character, to fight the next boss, which will then unlock the next resources necessary to upgrade your character, and fight yet another boss, which will then unlock more resources necessary to upgrade your character, and fight that boss, which will then unlock the resources necessary to upgrade your character, and fight the next boss, which will then unlock the... Oh, I got stuck in a loop. Anyway, the point is that the boss battles become key moments in the player's story, not just from a narrative perspective, but also from a progression perspective. I do plan to do pretty much the same thing, except for rather than having the boss battles unlock new weapons, they'll instead upgrade your current weapons by having all of the buffs you've collected get erased from your inventory and become embedded in the weapon itself. So for example, if you have a pistol that deals 10 damage, you equip the damage buff, it will now deal 15. But once you complete a boss battle, the pistol will upgrade itself to become a weapon that deals 15 damage by default, allowing you to equip another damage buff to bump up the weapon's damage to 22. If any of this sounds interesting to you, again, send me a message on Discord and I'll send over a Steam key for you to playtest. I'd also tell you to stay tuned for the next video by subscribing, but you've already done that. And for those who want to see the code breakdown, there's a link in the description for an unlisted video for it. I was gonna just put it at the end of this video, but I did it live, so you get to see me mess up all the numbers and stuff, and I think it's more interesting that way. Dude, get out of here! I hate my editor. We're the same person! I stand by what I said. Anyway, I think it's interesting, but I don't really want it to ruin my watch time, so... Yeah, there's a link to an unlisted video in the description.